Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for joining us. And one second, I need to start the recording. Oh, no, it is. Got it. Sorry. Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. And I want to get to Mark in discussion quickly. So I'll get into it quickly by thanking our many co-sponsoring organizations and everyone who's helped me to put this together. We've got a few moderators to help with the questions later. I'm Matt. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm a 3L at Duke. So the reason we organized this discussion, in part, is that there's been very little opportunity to talk about the events leading up to and this aftermath of the insurrection in January. And it seems strange because of the significance of this, including to us as law students. Like, if successful, there'd be no rule of law and no reason to be a lawyer. And even more importantly, the various efforts to overturn the election were led and spearheaded by lawyers, themselves members of the Conservative Federalist Society organization, graduates from law schools like ours. And they seem to play an outsized role in this ongoing uncertainty and conflict while working continuously to attack the rights and freedoms of many marginalized groups. So this is an ongoing problem in the legal field. It's originated far before January, but it's like a proverbial elephant in the room. We seem to have trouble to talk about it, and including in particular at Duke. And so even now, when it puts the entire system of law at jeopardy. So in the interest of opening this discourse and confronting these challenges head on, thanks to everyone here for taking part in this event. By the way, we'll have questions at the end of the discussion. You can just use the raise hand function and we'll unmute you. And I wanted to mention that we'll be recording the event, as you can see. So with that, thanks, Mark. Mark's a judicial analyst and Supreme Court correspondent at Slate. He's written about the Federalist Society for a long time, and more recently, specifically about the attack on the Capitol in January. So Mark, could you start by taking us through sort of broadly the reporting on this connection from November or before until now between FedSoc and the elements involved in the insurrection?
Yes, and thank you so much for having me, Matt. Thank you for hosting this event. Thanks to everyone who put it together. It's a real honor to be here virtually. I'm delighted to be having this conversation, which is, as you eloquently put it, I think a really important and urgent one, given the accelerating radicalization of the conservative legal movements that we have seen under the influence of the Federalist Society and really brought to a boil during the Capitol insurrection. So I guess just to start, you asked about my reporting and analysis of the Federalist Society's participation in the events leading up to the insurrection. And as you suggested, it's really important to note that it's not as if, the insurrection was the beginning and the end, the alpha and omega of the Federalist Society's involvement here, or I should say leaders within the Federalist Society involved with this violent attack. The Federalist Society's leaders and members played a major role in the run-up to the election and the weeks and months after the election in both trying to suppress the right to vote, trying to exclude marginalized communities from participating in the 2020 election, and then afterwards attempting to nullify the votes primarily of Black people living in large cities, trying to delegitimize the election, trying to throw out millions of votes, and ultimately, I think, creating or contributing to the atmosphere in which the insurrection occurred. So just briefly to start, before the election, of course, there were a number of states that cracked down on voting rights over the last few years, and a number of practices that had the effect of suppressing votes because of the pandemic and because of the slowdown of the Postal Service. And over again, when civil rights litigators tried to expand voting rights, tried to make it easier for people to vote, tried to prevent people from having to wait in line, often indoors for hours during a pandemic where people were not required to wear masks. We saw Federalist Society litigators come in and fight back and defend states and defend and work for Republican attorneys general who pushed back against these lawsuits, who defended voter suppression laws and tried to roll back the franchise in ways that almost always disproportionately affected minorities. One example here is the rather endless battle over mail voting in Pennsylvania. If you look at the attack on mail voting, both the law that was passed by the legislature expanding mail voting and the decision by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ensuring that ballots that were mailed on time would be counted, even if the Postal Service didn't deliver them on time. Those attacks were spearheaded in large part by Federalist Society attorneys. After the election, which Joe Biden very clearly won, we saw 18 state attorneys general ask the Supreme Court to throw out votes, every single vote, in fact, in 4 crucial swing states, and direct the state's legislatures to declare Donald Trump the true winner and assign their electoral votes to Trump. That act would constitute the largest single act of voter suppression, I think, in the history of the country. It would render the votes of millions of Americans null and void, and it specifically targeted cities like Detroit and Philadelphia, where most voters are Black. More than half of the state attorneys general who signed on to or supported this lawsuit were affiliated with or are members of the Federalist Society. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind moving forward as we're seeing these coalitions of Republican attorneys general suing the Biden administration over various actions. Remember how many of these folks were asking the Supreme Court of the United States to nullify millions of votes disproportionately cast by racial minorities and throw the election to Donald Trump. Of course, they didn't succeed, but they gave Trump new talking points to continue to delegitimize the election, right? To continue to reject the results and to help create this atmosphere that led to January 6th. January 6th, of course, was the day that began with Trump's Stop the Steal rally, which featured as a prominent speaker John Eastman, who continues to lead the Federalist Society's arguably most important practice group on federalism and the separation of powers. John Eastman is a luminary within the Federalist Society. He is undoubtedly one of the leaders of the organization. He stood on stage next to Rudy Giuliani when Rudy Giuliani urged the crowd to engage in trial by combat. He broke out into a broad grin when Rudy Giuliani uttered those words. I watched the C-SPAN footage many times. I wouldn't recommend you do the same. And then John Eastman went up to the microphone and delivered an utterly deranged and incoherent rant about how there were secret folders in Georgia's voting machines that Democrats had rigged to throw the state to Donald Trump, and essentially saying that Mike Pence had an obligation to reject votes from Georgia and other states and to make Trump the winner when Congress was counting electoral votes. We now know, thanks to some intrepid reporting, that John Eastman, Federalist Society luminary, was the chief attorney who advised Donald Trump to pressure Mike Pence to reject the electoral votes from states whose election outcomes Trump simply didn't accept because basically too many Black people voted and happened to be Democrats. John Eastman was there whispering in Trump's ear, urging him to pressure Pence to throw out those electoral votes and to make Trump the winner. He seems to have been the only voice of putative authority that was telling Trump behind the scenes that Pence could do this. And so I think we can thank him or blame him for Trump's campaign, his pressure campaign on Mike Pence to throw out those votes when Congress was counting electoral votes, which is of course what the Stop the Steal rally was all about, and was also what the Capitol insurrection was inspired by, right? Remember, as the insurrectionists raided the Capitol, not far from my house, that was a rather terrifying day, they were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." Why were they chanting that? Because Trump, whipped into a fervor by John Eastman, his close advisor, was convinced that Mike Pence had the power to change the outcome of this election. Trump, in turn, convinced his deranged supporters that they could pressure Pence into throwing out the results of the the election. And lo and behold, they believed him. They took him seriously and literally. And they broke into the Capitol and put many members of Congress's lives at stake and at risk. We now know, for instance, Mitt Romney was minutes or seconds away from being assaulted by these protesters. Mike Pence was rushed out of the chamber. This was a horrifying experience. And at the heart of it all, there's John Eastman. Right? There's John Eastman, and just behind him, there's nearly a dozen Republican state attorneys general who are affiliated or connected with the Federalist Society, delegitimizing this election, spreading these utterly bonkers conspiracy theories that are a total betrayal of any ostensible commitment to the rule of law, right? To basic legal ethics. And one might think that after so many luminaries, all belonging to one organization, helped contribute to delegitimizing an election and then a violent insurrection, that organization would have something to say. That organization might feel not necessarily complicit, but might feel a responsibility to look inward and to ask, how did we contribute to this? Why are so many of our members utterly radicalized and such foes of democracy and the franchise, and might put out some kind of statement or express some kind of discomfort with what happened, and basically draw a line in the sand and say, look, we debate things like voting rights all the time, but this is something different, this is something new, and we feel obligated to distance ourselves from the lunatics who led this charge to throw out the election and sack the Capitol. But we saw no such thing from the Federalist Society, right? And we saw a very muted response among members of the Federalist Society. Now, my friend David Latt has reported that a few members did write to leadership and urge leadership to distance itself from the insurrectionists. But of course, leadership did no such thing. It fell back on its position that it simply never issues public statements because, of course, it's a mere debating club and nothing else. And I understand that because we've seen time and again, especially under Trump, that the Federalist Society is really good at circling the wagons, really good at evading any kind of blame or responsibility, and really good at painting itself as the victim. Time and again, when people criticized Trump's judicial nominees who were disproportionately members of the Federalist Society, I believe 85% of Trump's appeals court nominees were either members of the Federalist Society or affiliated with the Federalist Society. We saw FedSoc members, claim that they were being targeted, that they were being harassed, that they were being victimized, that they are the underdogs, that they are the ones trying to restore balance to the political and legal debate, that they're nonpartisan, that they're just standing up for the rule of law and standing up for ideological diversity. The actions of the group, of its leaders, of its founders, all betray those claims, but it's very easy, I think, to hide behind that kind of false claim of neutrality. And that's what FedSoc has done, much to my disappointment and much to the disappointment, I think, of a lot of people who just believe in democracy and don't think it's good that an organization connected to 85% of the previous president's appeals court nominees doesn't have the spine, doesn't have the backbone to simply stand up and say, we're not going to let John Eastman continue to lead our most important practice group. We're not going to stand by silently while our members and our leaders contribute in the frivolous and outrageous efforts to disenfranchise voters and overturn the results of the election. It doesn't take that much backbone to distance yourself from a lunatic and a white supremacist like John Eastman, but FedSoc refused to do so, which really makes you wonder why. Why this organization is so terrified of any kind of accountability, why this organization is cowering behind the claim of being nothing more than a nonpartisan debate club while its members are out there shredding American democracy and further vilifying and degrading minority groups and communities. And that's sort of the issue that I want to talk about today, and I'm very much looking forward to discussion. I have my theories, and they do go beyond mere cowardice. I happen to suspect that FedSoc leaders understand that John Eastman is not an outlier, that these state attorneys general were not outliers within FedSoc, that in fact they spoke for many, many members of the Federalist Society, who were very eager to perform or aid or facilitate Trump's attempted coup in the 2020 election. We now know that a Federalist Society member within the Department of Justice hatched a scheme to oust the acting attorney general, to become the new acting attorney general, and then to try to force Georgia to throw out its electoral votes using the power of the Justice Department. That guy, he probably represents a lot of members of the Federalist Society who don't have such prominence and power, but aspire to it, right? Right now, as we speak, at Duke and many other law schools, the next generation of conservative lawyers are attending Federalist Society meetings. They're all chatting about what underdogs they are. They're all chatting about how difficult it is to be a conservative at law school today. As Justice Alito recently said, basically no one faces more discrimination than conservative law students in this country. And they're looking to these state AGs and people like John Eastman for inspiration, and they're finding it. And if I were a FedSoc leader and I saw all of those young faces ready to be the next generation to destroy American democracy, I probably wouldn't want to speak out either. I would want to let the wheels keep turning, because FedSoc is winning. Joe Biden's victory does not mean it will stop winning. FedSoc is ascendant. Its ideology has captured the federal judiciary. And the radicalization we're seeing of the conservative legal movement, it's scary stuff, but it shows no signs of slowing down. If anything, it's going to accelerate under Joe Biden, I fear. So again, happy to chat about these issues. I know that Matt has some more questions for me, and we're going to engage in a bit of a dialogue. But I'm really happy that we're having this event and we're talking about this out in the open, because it's really important to understand this isn't some kind of guilt by association thing. It's not as though a few randos who paid the $50 membership fee to the Federalist Society were wearing Viking hats and marching into the Capitol. This was an organized attempt to facilitate a coup, with Federalist Society leaders at the helm at every step of the way, contributing to this lawless action. And I think if we don't now take a step back and wonder how we got here and where exactly we're going, we're pretty much doomed to repeat this next time around and indefinitely into the future.
Thanks so much, Mark. And yeah, I had a few follow-up questions before we get to wider questioning, but you already talked briefly about this sort of the future, and that we might face this the same time around. But do you see any change, maybe not in Federalist Society as a whole silence, but maybe individual chapters or members? Have there been some dissenters to this? So leading message of silence?
Like I said, David Latt has done some reporting suggesting that some sort of mid-level members have urged leadership to speak out, or at least to remove John Eastman from his post. I have personally spoken with some sort of rank and file members of the Federalist Society who are unhappy with what's happened, who are disappointed with leadership for failing to speak out against this. But none of the members who I know have, torn up their membership cards or given up on FedSoc. And in fact, a lot of them over the last couple of weeks or last couple of months have softened up a little bit on their anger toward leadership. And I think that's a further demonstration of this wagon circling mentality, where, the FedSoc members and the organization as a whole, they really need a safe space. They really need a kind of silo, free from criticism, free from outside critiques, anything that might trigger this kind of sense of victimization that is so crucial to the identity of FedSoc, right? To take a step back, this is an organization that was formed under the belief that liberals had just completely captured the legal establishment in the courts at a time when, of course, first Burger and then Rehnquist were Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It was not exactly, screaming liberal body in the 1980s. But conservative professors and law students felt like they were a victimized minority. And if they wanted to argue that, women shouldn't receive equal pay for equal work, or gay people should be able to be hauled out of their homes, arrested and imprisoned for having sex, they needed a safe space to do that. And that's, of course, what Federalist Society became. Fast forward today, when FedSoc members and FedSoc groups see this outside criticism, I think that same instinct comes back into play. This sense that, well, they might have a point, but they take it too far. And at the end of the day, there are enemies, there are ideological foes, and they're trying to crush us. And FedSoc is sort of the last bastion. There's this meme that circulated around conservative Facebook groups. Ginny Thomas, Clarence Thomas's wife, posted it. There's a picture of Donald Trump. And it said, they're not really coming after me, Donald Trump. They're coming after you, conservatives, and I stand in the way. And I think there's a very similar mentality within FedSoc, that there's this desire among liberals to just crush and stamp out all conservative thought in the legal academy and the judiciary, to cancel conservatives in the common parlance. First they came for Dr. Seuss and I did not speak out, and so on. And I think that's what we're going to continue seeing now in the weeks and months after the insurrection, as we see conservatives try to rewrite what happened, claiming that this wasn't really violence, that this was just Antifa, all of that nonsense. I think we're just going to see a lot of retconning and a lot of wagon circling in which FedSoc members say, we're still in it together. We still share these common goals. And we're not going to let liberals like me, like, ACS, like other progressive groups, we're not going to allow them to crush our continued ascendance within the legal community and within the courts.
I see. And turning to that idea of wagon circling, and you talked about this briefly earlier, the idea that the organization is just a debating society, or bipartisan or nonpartisan. I wondered if you could, expand more on, how you respond to that line of thinking, or whether, how you feel about that argument that is commonly thrown out.
Well, look, FedSoc holds debates, of course, on law school campuses. You all know, perhaps you've attended some or participated in some. I don't mean to say that all of them are malign. And in fact, the existence of these debates is often used as a talking point by FedSoc to deny any kind of political activity. They say, oh, yeah, you claim we're a secret society with all this influence, but all we want to do is get together and eat Chick-fil-A and talk about all of the legal issues of the day. And to some extent that does happen. Now, some of the events they hold, one might question why exactly this debate is occurring. Do gay people deserve basic rights? Should their marriages be nullified? Should they be stripped of their parentage over their children? These are questions that FedSoc groups like to ask, which are of course provocative ones, but perhaps we could say, fair game for intellectual discussion, as dehumanizing and as degrading as it may be for gay people at that school and in the audience. That's free speech culture. And I don't mean to say that those events should be canceled or driven out with pitchforks or anything like that. But at the end of the day, the front-facing side of FedSoc is not really the most influential side. The front-facing side of FedSoc can be thought of as a kind of recruiting arm. It's the side of FedSoc that takes young law students, often conservative, but sometimes just sort of adrift in their ideology, and gives them a place of meaning, a place where they can find, a community that they feel they belong to. They make friends, they find mentors among professors, and all of that, of course, can be very healthy. And I think it's in some ways a good function for student groups to serve. That's what they're there for. But it doesn't stop with friendship and community and mentorship, right? Because the Federalist Society is above all else kind of like a networking group. That's exactly why 85% of Trump Circuit Court nominees are FedSoc members or FedSoc affiliated, because what happens next is that basically this rather close-knit group participates in what I like to call affirmative action for conservatives, right? So if you're a liberal law student or a centrist law student and you want a clerkship, you might try to do the right thing and go through the clerkship hiring plan that's been in effect for several years now that aims to level the playing field and ensure that everyone has a fair shot at a clerkship, even if they don't have connections or special privileges. You might find yourself competing against dozens or hundreds of other students with similar qualifications who are trying to get the same very limited number of spots, with judges who themselves are trying to do the right thing, trying to diversify and expand the group of clerks who serve in the federal judiciary. That's tough, and your odds aren't very good. Perhaps some of you have won clerkships. I congratulate you. It's obviously a huge step in your career, and it can be very enriching. But if you talk to your conservative classmates, many of them have had a very different experience, because most conservative judges have rejected any kind of clerkship hiring plan, any kind of standardized practice. And what's happened instead, and this is a bit of an oversimplification, and this is one route, there are others, but what often happens is conservative judges have their favored law professors, conservative law professors, right? And the conservative judges reach out to these law professors, and they ask the professors to identify the up and coming conservative students who seem to be rising stars in the conservative legal world. And they pluck those students out and they put them on a special fast track to a clerkship, which itself becomes a fast track to either an appointment in a state attorney general's office, to the Justice Department, to some other kind of political appointment, and eventually to the federal judiciary or to state courts. We've also seen a real, FedSoc infusion in places like Florida. I think almost all of the current justices of the Florida Supreme Court are active members of the Federalist Society. And that is not at all fair. I don't think anyone could really claim it's fair unless you buy into this victimhood mentality that, conservative students are such victims of this, dominating ideology of liberalism that they have to band together with these few professors who are able to see the truth in order to rise through the ranks. I think it's really just conservative action at its most blatant and at its least fair, because under the guise of ideological diversity, it's creating a new club, a club of mostly heterosexual white men who tend to be conservative law students who get a fast track to a clerkship because they hate abortion and LGBTQ people, because they hate agency independence and whatever other obsessions the Federalist Society has. If you share those views, you get on that fast track. And this leads to really bizarre situations like at Harvard Law School, where the career office sends out plaintive emails to students saying, won't somebody please apply to work for Lawrence Van Dyke, the anti-LGBTQ Trump nominee to the Ninth Circuit, who was rated not qualified by the American Bar Association, but still got confirmed. Because none of you seem to want to work for this guy, this utterly unqualified bigot. Why don't you? What's wrong? Why wouldn't you want to work for a man who spent his career litigating against LGBTQ equality? All you have to do is either compromise your principles or become a conservative, and you've got a fast track right after law school to the Ninth Circuit. So that's a side of FedSoc that I think we need to spend a lot more time talking about. More and more when I talk to law students who have very provocative classmates, like the individual who brandished a gun on Zoom at HLS last year, they say, of course he was the president of his FedSoc chapter. Of course he has a clerkship with William Pryor on the 11th Circuit lined up, because the stars align if you're willing to buy into this ideology. That is probably the most benign side of FedSoc's networking. The other side of it, which is very much shrouded in secrecy, is the dark money machine that helps to fund FedSoc, that is closely affiliated with FedSoc, that's largely overseen by Leonard Leo, who was, of course, the former leader of FedSoc, who then advised Trump on his judicial nominees and is now running a voter suppression group that spreads utter falsehoods about voter fraud in an effort to justify Jim Crow-style voter suppression laws. I think it tells you a lot, if you just look at his career trajectory, exactly about what FedSoc thinks about voting rights. Leonard Leo is the master of dark money. He's figured out how to lavishly fund FedSoc through these dark money networks, and also how to spin off his own dark money groups to do things like support Donald Trump's judicial nominees through these shell groups that purport to be independent or purport to be, just basically charitable organizations, but are actually an arm of Leonard Leo's dark money machine. I've done some reporting. The Washington Post has done great investigations about all of the shell companies that Leonard Leo has registered right over the river from me in Virginia. The BH Fund, a company that doesn't really exist, that Leonard Leo uses to funnel money to his preferred causes, using donors who he met and connected with through the Federalist Society. Until fairly recently, George Mason Law School, now Antonin Scalia School of Law, it appears that its dark money donors had say over students who could, admission of students into the school, over the selection of professors at the school. This dark money network, it sort of reaches into every aspect of the conservative legal movement. And because it is shrouded in all of this anonymity, when you talk about it, you can start to sound a little bit like a conspiracy theorist. There's nothing conservatives love more than mocking Senator Sheldon Whitehouse for taking out his whiteboard and drawing all of these connections. But Whitehouse is not the conspiracy theorist here. And it's not really a conspiracy theory. It's just the sad truth that conservatives have absolutely mastered the dark money laws of this country. They've exploited them to help fund their groups like FedSoc, and associated organizations. And they're now using these same groups to oppose greater transparency laws, to oppose disclosure laws that would pull the lid off of these shell companies and reveal who their actual donors are and lead to some political accountability for the billionaires who are funding this movement for their own self-interest. So that's a very long-winded answer to say that, yeah, it's a debate club. There's debates, and that's fine. I'm not here to shut down debate. Good for them. But that's sort of the tip of the spear. And all of this other stuff that goes on ends up being much more important, and yet almost never gets covered because, like I said, as soon as you start talking about it, it's very easy for others to sort of shut you down as babbling nonsense because they've so successfully shrouded all of their goings on in secrecy.
Thank you, Mark. And this brings up an interesting point of, and I'm muted again. Sorry, I'm especially thinking of in the last few months and in the wake of the events of January 6th, what can law schools do given that outsized influence and effect on the clerkship process? And have law schools, have you seen any sort of successful programs to deal with this issue in the legal field?
So, I would love to be able to say, just join the American Constitution Society, of which I am a member and a supporter, and, balance out FedSoc's power. But the American Constitution Society is never going to get close to FedSoc in terms of influence. And there are a lot of reasons we could talk about, but the main one is this. Democratic presidents don't outsource judicial nominations the way that Republicans do. A Democratic president is never going to call in the head of ACS or any similar group and say, produce a list of your favorite members and I'll make them federal judges. And yet that's what Donald Trump did with Leonard Leo. And so conservative law students know that if they get on that fast track, that they've got a good chance in maybe 10 years to become a federal judge. They've got this immense power once they join FedSoc. They're on a list. They keep moving up the list. And if they play their cards right, then the next Republican president is just going to outsource judicial nominations. And if you're high enough on the list and you've proved that you really don't like LGBTQ equality and abortion and all of that stuff, then, you know, you'll get chosen. ACS is never going to have that kind of leverage, that kind of power, that kind of pipeline. And so we hear a lot about, you know, we need a liberal pipeline to these positions, to the federal judiciary. I just don't foresee it ever happening, because liberals are not going to do something like FedSoc did, which is offer 0 Black appeals court nominees. Maybe one, I can't remember, but you know, I crunched some of the numbers on this, and the vast majority of Trump's appeals court nominees were heterosexual white men. There were a few women, a few people of color, and we saw conservatives really vigorously tokenize those few nominees and say, oh, well, look, we have this one woman of color who we've nominated, so you're not allowed to criticize our lack of diversity. I think that's tokenism in the most disgusting way. Liberals care about diversity in a much deeper sense. They care about bringing people with a diverse background, diverse experiences, understandings of the law into the federal judiciary, people of color, you know, sexual and gender minorities. Can you imagine Donald Trump nominating a transgender person to the federal judiciary as he simultaneously bans them from the military and tries to stamp out their rights across federal law? Of course not. Democrats want that kind of thing. They want a broad array of people, kind of rainbow coalition of folks who will better represent the country that they serve and look more like the country that they serve, which I think is a noble goal. And you just can't get there by outsourcing judicial nominations to ACS. So going back to your question, look, I happen to think, and this is a very controversial position, I happen to think that liberal professors after January 6th should not be participating in FedSoc events. And I think that it is appropriate for progressive law students to politely shame liberal professors who agree to participate in these events for a couple reasons. The first is I just don't understand why you would want to affiliate yourself with such a radicalized group of insurrectionists ever at all. That seems wrong and really obvious to me. But also when liberal professors participate in these events, they're helping to bolster the vision of FedSoc, right? The public image that FedSoc wants us all to buy into, this sense that it's only a debate club, nothing more. And that, you know, it accepts a wide range of viewpoints. And that, of course, look, they invite all of these liberals to come talk. So how could they be bad when they just want to debate the issues? As I've said, and I think I've tried to express very explicitly, like, I don't believe that self-image is the reality. I think that's just a little part of it, and that the other parts of the group are much more malign. And when liberal professors participate, they're just helping to bolster that image. And I think it's tough, especially for younger liberal professors who want to participate in academic debate, who don't want to seem like bad colleagues. They're going to these faculty meetings with FedSoc professors who they have to work with, they have to, you know, share lunch with. They don't want to alienate them. They want to rise in the ranks within their school, maybe get a tenure track position. And it's harder to do that if you don't play nice. And so, like I said, I think there's an argument against what I'm saying. I think that there are people who say liberal law professors should participate if they want. And I get that, I respect that. I don't agree though. I just cannot agree with that. And I also think there's a real question of what progressive students should do when FedSoc is hosting a debate that is just downright offensive, right? A debate, for instance, about whether the courts or the government should revoke same-sex couples' parental rights over their children. What to do when that event comes to your campus. I don't think the answer is to try to cancel it or shut it down. I think that sets a bad precedent. I can't support that. But I think a protest of that event, I think strongly urging progressive students and progressive professors not to attend that event. I think those are very valuable tools. It might not seem like much, but sort of bolstering this sense that what FedSoc is up to here is not really acceptable. It's retrograde, it's dehumanizing, it's perpetuating all kinds of forms of bigotry and white supremacy, counter speech in short. I think there's a lot of room for that. And again, I don't mean that there should be an attempt to revoke student funding for these groups or shut them down. I think it would be much better, both substantively and optics-wise, frankly, for progressive students to say, we're not going to participate with that. We're not going to play footsie with bigots. We're not going to sort of entertain these notions of fair debate when the debate is whether people deserve humanity. We're just going to say no, because we don't believe that this conversation and this debate has a real place on our campus, and so we can't support it. And I think just doing stuff like that, as minor as it might seem, could go a long way toward making new students, people who don't have set views here, people who might still be looking for a community on law school campus, realize that maybe FedSoc is not the way to go. Maybe there's another community, another group of students who are willing to take in people who are, you know, perhaps even right of center, people who don't have strongly formed views, who are not going to deny the humanity of everyone, who aren't going to try to shut down speech or retaliate against speech, but instead sort of light the way forward to more civilized and enlightened discussion, and a total rejection of those who support insurrection and white supremacy and all of these horrible things that I think in reality FedSoc has come to stand for. So these are not really these are not answers that will solve everything. I think I'm open to others' ideas here, and I have debated this a lot with myself, but there's got to be a broad-based law school campus-based movement against FedSoc that's not rooted in trying to shut it down or anything like that, but in showing the alternative and winning over converts and other individuals by saying, we're better than they are. We're not stooping to their level. We're not funded by a massive dark money machine. You know, we are the better, more humane way to go, even if you don't share all of our views.
Thanks so much, Mark. That's definitely a lot to think about. And unfortunately, I'm a 3L, so there'll be, you know, I'll be gone from law school soon, but hopefully the 1Ls and 2Ls can, you know, really consider how to get that sort of movement going. I have one last quick question before we get to the audience questions. So, and this is something I really wanted to talk about because it's always sort of confusing me a bit, but can you explain sort of the role of originalism as an ideology in sort of these arguments, both, you know, the insurrection related things, the sort of conservative pipeline and of law clerks and judges, and, you know, how does it fit into the whole system?
So I'll expand that to originalism and textualism, right, which are sort of the bedrock tools of many Federalist Society attorneys. There's a bit of a push against that after Bostock, because gasp, textualism led to an expansion of LGBTQ rights, and if it leads to that, you know, something has to have gone awry. But look, I have no problem with originalism and textualism. I think they're perfectly valid modes of interpretation. I think they're often very useful. And I think, as Bostock illustrates, they can lead to progressive outcomes. They're not necessarily always jury-rigged to lead to the precise outcomes that the Republican Party wants. But if you look at how originalism and textualism have played out in the courts, you see a rather disturbing trend. And that is that conservative judges, and now to some degree conservative activists, Republicans, this is spread everywhere, they say if you aren't using originalism and textualism, then you're not taking a legitimate approach to the law. And if your judicial outcome is not rooted in originalism or textualism, it's not a legitimate decision. And I think the word legitimacy here is really important. My friend Mike Sachs calls this the one true way methodology. It's got to be possible, I think, in theory, to support originalism and textualism without ruling out all other modes of interpretation. But that's not what we see rhetorically from conservatives. And so what that leads to is a situation where if the Supreme Court does something like protect the right to bodily autonomy, protect the fundamental right to enter into a marriage with the partner of your choice, conservatives will say that's not just wrong, right? It's not just incorrect, but it's fundamentally illegitimate, and it's exercising a power that the courts don't actually have, which I think gives them a tool to really kind of undermine and subvert those decisions in a way that liberals can't and don't. And I think that's pretty ironic when you look at how many decisions the Supreme Court has issued that are very conservative, that do align with the Republican Party's most recent platform, and that are very obviously not originalist or textualist. I mean, there's that classic line from Scalia where he says the 11th Amendment doesn't mean what it says. That's sort of Scalian textualism in a nutshell, sadly. And then with originalism, look at cases like Janus. Janus was the decision in which the Supreme Court invalidated public sector unions' right to collect fair share fees from non-members. Basically, these unions were collecting this money to help negotiate for better contracts for workers. And the Supreme Court said, you know, collecting that money is a violation of the First Amendment right against compelled speech. What's really interesting about Janus is that some originalist law professors who lean right filed a brief in that case, arguing that there was simply no originalist defense of that outcome, that you really cannot use originalism to get to a place where the government cannot allow unions to take a relatively small amount of money from people who choose to work in the public sector just to represent their interests at the bargaining table. And in fact, these originalists said, you know, Janus is building along an entire line of cases, many of them anti-union cases, that are totally unrooted from originalism, that have no basis in originalism. And Justice Alito's majority opinion in Janus basically just ignores all of that. And there's just a few lines where Justice Alito said, we're not going to engage in this halfway originalism because we're not going to overrule that entire line of cases, so we don't really care. And I think that kind of gives up the game because the court did not engage in halfway originalism, it engaged in zero-way originalism. There was no originalism in Janus. That opinion cannot be squared with any plausible meaning of the First and 14th Amendments. And yet 5 conservative justices, all of whom purport to be originalists to some degree, signed on. Another note, I think it's really interesting that Justice Neil Gorsuch, purports to be a devout originalist and textualist. He asked no questions during oral arguments in Janus. And I was observing him and watching it. I found that very curious because he's usually quite voluble. But I suspect that he must know on some level that you can't use originalism to get you to the outcome that Republicans and conservatives wanted in Janus because they hate unions and hate public sector unions. So faced with the option of adhering to his principles and getting to a liberal outcome or abandoning his principles and getting to a conservative outcome, Gorsuch chose the latter route. I'm not saying that Gorsuch is a total hack. I think if you look at Bostock, he's sometimes willing to follow his principles to a liberal outcome. Don't think the same is true of Alito. But, obviously there's something wrong here when conservatives and specifically conservative judges can simultaneously use originalism and textualism as a weapon to bludgeon the other side, to say that their entire conception of the law is fundamentally illegitimate, and then turn around and abandon their own rules when it's politically inconvenient for them to adhere to them. And that is just a problem that I think will continue to plague originalist jurisprudence, because if you look at a case like Heller, the case that established an individual right to bear arms under the Second Amendment, Justice Scalia is a bad historian, right? He is a very poor reader of historical documents. And a number of actual historians have gone over what Scalia claimed these founding era documents said in Heller and pointed out all of the ways that he was just wrong. He was just objectively incorrect in his assessment of these documents that he claimed proved that the Second Amendment protected an individual right to bear arms. But what is the Supreme Court going to do? What are conservatives who have really kind of organized their movement around the Second Amendment to some degree? Are they going to turn around and say, ah, yes, the history has illustrated, the historiography has now proven that Scalia, our secular god Scalia, was incorrect, and there is no individual right to bear arms? It seems unlikely to me, because there are much broader interests at stake here, including the massive amounts of money that gun rights groups like the NRA spend in conservative politics and this conservative dark money network. So again, top line point here, I'm not anti-originalist, but I am very, very disappointed with the faux originalists on the court, and very distressed to see them use this ideology, like I said, as a weapon, as a bludgeon, and then just abandon it when it might lead to something that Democrats like and Republicans don't.
Got it. Thank you so much, Mark. I want to tell you student questions now, and Mark agreed to stay to 1:40 for everyone who can. So you can use the raise hand function to ask your questions. I or one of the other moderators will, well, I'll call on you. One of the other moderators will unmute you. All right, Zachary, I think I've
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Great. Mark, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for the journalism. I think you do a great job of bringing complex legal issues to a broader audience without sacrificing any of the intellectual rigor of it.
Wow, thank you. That's very kind.
Oh yeah. So question, you mentioned some ways that we can kind of maybe begin to get the Federalist Society maybe out of campuses or diminish their influence. And could you just, you said you've had that conversation with other lawyers before. Can you offer any more thoughts on that? Just because they seem to absorb the tactics. You mentioned that, when people protest them or ignore them, or they use it as sort of a justification of that they are marginalized. So any more thoughts on that? If you don't have any, that's fine. And then sub question, how does it feel that Stephen Breyer follows you on Twitter?
Wow, terrific questions. I'll take the latter one first. It feels great. So happy to have created a one-day scandal. For those of you who aren't aware, I pointed out that Justice Breyer wrote, "I dissent," instead of "with respect, I dissent," in his first dissent to Amy Coney Barrett's first majority opinion. And he then amended the opinion to add "with respect." And look, I'm not going to take all credit for that, just like 90%. I did go through all of the randos who screamed at me for pointing this out. I didn't find any who obviously fit the bill for Stephen Breyer, but we've got an intern for the spring semester here at Slate, and I think I have a very important task for her now to go over that. With regard to your actual question, I think you've identified the exact rejoinders to everything that I said, and I think it's a real problem. And I think absorbing is the right word. Like there is a real talent for absorbing this counter speech, or absorbing, protests to the Federalist Society, where they cite this as proof that they're beleaguered, that they're underdogs. But I have to believe that all of us who have just been through 4 years of Trump have developed some skills against that kind of gaslighting, and have developed maybe some better defense mechanisms against that kind of reversal of victim and offender. And one other technique that I think would be helpful in addition to not always just protesting, but ignoring and encouraging people not to participate in these events, is, like I said, to create a viable alternative to prevent what I call FedSoc drift, which is this thing that happens often in 1L, where students are looking for a home, a place of belonging, and FedSoc has the best food, they've got all these perks, you get that fast track, and people are going to gravitate toward that, even if they don't necessarily hold these beliefs. I mean, I know liberals who are members of FedSoc because they don't feel super strongly about their views. They might hold a few kind of heretical positions. Maybe they thought SELA law was the best decision of all time. And they're like, okay, time to join FedSoc and get all these perks. It's like, I still use Amazon, even though I know it's horrible for everyone. And I think we have to meet people where they are and not just shame them for FedSoc drift, and understand that the allure of well-catered events in law school is a strong one, and provide an alternative that goes beyond just ACS events and goes more toward that sense of community that FedSoc provides. We would be fooling ourselves if we said that FedSoc was all about the rise to power. Yes, the power that FedSoc offers its members is so tantalizing. How could you turn that away? But there's more to it than that. There's a sense of like-minded compatriots. There's a sense, like I said, of community. And there's a sense that we're all in this together and we're going to help each other out. We're going to lift each other up. I don't know that progressive students always do enough of that. I don't know that progressive students are always lifting each other up to the degree that they could and should. I think part of that is because, like I said, they may be competing for the same spots in a way that FedSoc students just aren't. There may be more competition for these students to rise through the ranks, to get these plum positions, whatever. But I think you have to look beyond that, and you have to really assess what FedSoc does well, how it provides the sense of community, how it brings in these students and keeps them there beyond the raw allure of power, and frankly try to copy it and try to provide like a light side version of the dark side that FedSoc offers, to use, Star Warsian terms. I know it's not the dark side, but there's got to be a progressive alternative, and it doesn't just have to be one group, and it doesn't have to have a name, but it's got to provide the kind of benefits to some degree, the kind of friendships, the kind of mentorships that FedSoc has excelled in. I don't see that on most law school campuses, and I really wish I did.
Thanks, Zachary, for the question. And thank you, Mark. Yeah, I think that'd be really important too. Next is Karen. I'm going to unmute you or let you unmute yourself. I don't know how it works.
Thanks. Hi, thank you. So I actually wanted to continue down that depressing road because I think that we see and have seen that progressive student groups and progressives in general, we often form circular firing squads and go after each other. And one of the things I've noticed about FedSoc is that there is a certain drum beat that they're marching to that we sort of intentionally get rid of, that we don't want, because we want to be able to have a variety and a diversity of thoughts. So I guess I want to ask for a little bit more on what you just were talking about, which is what we can do as law students to try to create a progressive alternative beyond just ACS or NLG that gives us a way to really face this.
Yeah, so first of all, like, great point there about the drumbeat. And I think if I could sort of rephrase that, what I sensed when I was in law school was that progressives look at FedSoc, they see the ideological conformity, sort of ironic because they claim not to be an ideological conformity, but of course they are. They see students marching to the same drumbeat. They see these, this sort of adherence to the same set of views. And they say, we don't want to be like that, understandably. Like, we don't want to just have a bunch of students who all believe largely the same thing. We're progressives. We believe in, individual beliefs, and we want to create an open space for dialogue, and we want to be able to disagree with each other, and we don't want to all feel like we're adhering to the same rules and the same views. But like you said, sometimes that can kind of crash into the other less happy liberal tendency of the circular firing squad, where there's a sense that the students who espouse some views are sort of hopeless, they cannot be salvaged, or they've said something that cannot be tolerated, and they sort of have to be, excluded permanently. I'm not going to say canceled. I'm trying not to use that word, but it's a real thing. It's a real phenomenon. I think that, of course, in 2021, we all have to balance our desire for inclusion and diversity and equity with our desire not to become like the crazy Dr. Seuss, Mr. Potato Head cancel culture warriors. I think that there's got to be a way for progressive students to say, take in a 1L who doesn't really have firmly established beliefs here, who might espouse some views that we consider offensive, who might say something like marriage is between one man and one woman, and for us to say, well, let's talk about it. Let's work through where these views come from and why you have them. And here's a discussion group, or here's a Zoom, or here's a group thread or a WhatsApp thread where we can chat more and, in a friendly way that's not confrontational necessarily. I'm not saying that you need to invite KKK members into your Clubhouse or your Snapchat or whatever, okay? I'm just saying that FedSoc is able to absorb people with sort of idiosyncratic differing views and manage to bring them toward the sort of center of FedSoc, manage to get them to buy in to this slate of views, this slate of ideologies that makes up the core of FedSoc. And I don't think progressives are really good at doing that. And partially, I think that's because we have a sense of righteous indignation against discrimination and against unfairness and inequity. And I think that's good and healthy. And I certainly share that. And I think if I were a 1L and one of my classmates said marriage is between one man and one woman, I would have been like, screw you, get out of my WhatsApp thread. But I'm a little older now, and looking back, those folks are young. Most people in law school are relatively young, in their 20s. They haven't settled on a fixed set of beliefs necessarily. FedSoc is able to take that play and morph it into something that's very helpful for the conservative legal movement. And I don't see progressives necessarily doing that. So, I mean, I'm interested in what you think about what I just said, Karen. Do you think I'm like going too soft on people who hold really offensive beliefs, or like, do you think that that's potentially a viable route there?
Well, I'm an older law student, and I used to be a professor, so I definitely have had to deal with the conservative views in the classroom and other places where they weren't very popular. So, I mean, I agree with you that maybe we do need to be a little more open to different ideas, and maybe get rid of some of our progressive purity tests, even though we like them.
Yeah, we like them, and we like them for a reason, because sometimes they can be helpful. And having a pure sense that, not wanting Black people to vote, I think that's probably good, and that's maybe not something we want to compromise. But at the end of the day, when you look at just how much FedSoc is winning and just how much we are losing, I have to believe that a little experimentation has got to be in order.
Thanks all. Next is Dylan here.
Hi, so like everyone else has said, thank you so much for being here today. What you said about trying to have those conversations with 1Ls or possibly with conservatives in general really kind of struck a chord with me, because in my experience, not necessarily with my classmates, but with conservative family members, for example, trying to have those discussions ends up with them just kind of pulling that victimization card and saying, no, it's just my opinion. And any attempt to try and talk to me about it is really just kind of attacking me, and it's just my opinion and let me have it. So I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on that narrative, kind of in terms of the victimization you were talking about earlier, and what we can do to address that.
Okay, so my first reaction to that is like, it's really ironic, because of course these are the same folks who are claiming that liberals are going out and canceling everybody, that there's this huge problem with cancel culture, that liberals can't tolerate a diversity of views. And then if liberals try to have like a really just basic meaningful discussion with someone, with a conservative who doesn't agree with them, they turn around and they say, you're canceling me, like, you're the one who can't deal with different views, and I'm the one who's being victimized here. And it's a toxic dynamic. It's not something I think any of us enjoy. I think that tone may matter as much as substance here. And look, I live in DC, which is like 95% Democratic. I'm not the one who has to go deal with people who have views I find abhorrent, frankly. I guess I'm just lucky in that way, or I guess maybe I've chosen my own bubble. if people shut down when you try to talk to them about these issues, I don't think you have an obligation to try to save them. I'm not here saying like you need to go win over hearts and minds to convince your conservative relatives that you are a human deserving of equal rights. Like I'm truly not saying that. I'm suggesting something a little bit more tactical here about the dynamic that we're seeing on law school campuses and why that dynamic has led to such a flourishing of FedSoc and led to such an anemic presence of progressive groups and I think progressive communities. And I think like part of it has got to be the underdog mentality that many conservatives have and many conservative students have. And part of it has got to be the sense that when conservatives are challenged on their views, that's an effort to cancel them, that's an effort to try to shut them down. And so the sad reality is you've got to meet people where they are. If they're not willing to engage with you, period, there's nothing you can do. Like your homophobic Aunt Sally is never going to go to your cousin's same-sex wedding, and that's that. And it's nobody's job to convince her. But there are some people on law school campuses, there have got to be, who are gettable, who have not yet gone over to, the dark side, who are not going to shut down when you try to talk to them. And law school is supposed to be a place where that kind of exchange of views, where no one is canceling anybody else, everybody is just having a discussion, where that exchange of views can flourish. FedSoc has created a place where that exchange of views can flourish as long as you buy into this basic program, right? This, like what I call the slate of ideologies within FedSoc. Progressives need to start building something kind of like that, not a slate of ideologies that you have to buy into, but a community, a space where people don't feel like they're necessarily at risk of cancellation, where they can chat about these issues and not shut down. And like I said, maybe tone here is part of the issue. Karen and I were discussing this. There is a purity test sometimes for progressives. There is a sense that if you take one step in the wrong direction, that you've committed some kind of mortal sin. I think as progressives, we still believe in things like redemption and mercy. And if that is the case, then these conversations are plausible. They can happen, and just because they're difficult doesn't mean that they're impossible.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Dylan, for the question. I think next on the list was Andrew Barson.
Yeah, hi, thanks for the talk. So you talked a little bit earlier about the pipeline, and I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that because it's my observation that there exists a strong perception among incoming law students and among law students in general that FedSoc membership is essentially a prerequisite for, at this point, the majority of federal clerkships, given the makeup of the judiciary. And that having that hat on the rack that you can put on if you need to, if you're applying for these jobs, if you want a career in the federal judiciary, in sort of higher levels of the justice system, is a necessity for your career prospects, and to not do it would be imprudent. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, I guess, to the extent to which that perception is actually reflective of reality, and to the extent that it is reflective of reality, is the cat out of the bag? Is it just too late? I mean, what do you do about that? It seems like that's a really strong impetus for a lot of people, completely non-ideological, non-community oriented, just strictly self-interested, career motivated, right? And which is understandable, I think. So I wonder, how do you address that?
Right. So I think, first of all, this is where being really vocal about opposing what FedSoc is doing and what FedSoc is standing for, presenting this outward facing view of just a sort of objective or nonpartisan debating club, and then in the shadows, creating this clerkship pipeline that goes around all of the rules and just creates affirmative action for conservative students, and also, sort of fronts this huge dark money machine. Like, being vocal about that hopefully will convince some people that it's not worth the price of your soul to get a clerkship. On the other hand, there are people who are going to say, and as you pointed out, like, look, I'll join the club, I'll go to a couple of events, I'll have it on my resume, and that way say I will be in the running for a clerkship. And as you implied correctly, most of the federal judiciary now, sadly, is very, very conservative and Trump aligned, right? Or I guess aligned with Trumpism is the way I would put it. And so you have a lot of conservative judges, people like James Ho, who just hire, firebrand ideologues as clerks and would never consider hiring even a centrist, let alone a progressive, because their chambers are a safe space for conservative FedSoc thought, and they're not interested in any kind of dissenting views. That's a huge problem. It's one that's probably going to change to some degree under Joe Biden, right? Democrats have the Senate. In theory, there will be a bit more of a balancing out of the judiciary. And even if the Supreme Court remains in conservative hands, we're going to see the lower courts start to swing back in the other direction. But as I mentioned earlier, and as you noted, because there's not this singular liberal pipeline to those positions, it's never going to be a copy of what we see with FedSoc. So what to do about students who aren't particularly conservative but join FedSoc for a line on their resume? I think a healthy dose of shame is in order. I think that one of the aspects of being in a legal career and being an adult is deciding how many of your principles you're willing to trade away in order to get career advancement. This is something that students deal with when they, say, interview for big law and decide whether they'll spend their first 5 years of practice enforcing mandatory arbitration clauses against victims of sexual harassment and wage theft. This is something that students do when they decide to take on all of these student loans, even though they want to be a civil rights litigator after law school and get paid absolutely nothing to do the Lord's work. And I think we should look at joining FedSoc as being of a piece with those kinds of moral balancings that we have to do. My friends in the People's Parity Project have spoken eloquently about this in a recent New York Times interview. Law school professors often like to pretend that the work of law is morally neutral, and hopefully, most of you will agree with me that it is not. That enforcing mandatory arbitration against victims of sexual harassment is not morally neutral. It is in fact evil and something that horrible people do and that should not be doing because it is immoral and bad. And I think that joining FedSoc is not quite that bad necessarily, but it's still up there. It's still an affiliation with a group that's filled with white supremacists and insurrectionists who tried to overturn the 2020 election. And if a student can't look that truth in the face, if a student can't say, joining FedSoc is not worth the cost of my soul, getting a potential fast track to a clerkship, or even just being in the running for a clerkship is not worth it, then maybe there's not a lot of use trying to get them to see the light. And maybe they're destined for the kind of amoral or immoral legal career that so many conservatives take on. Maybe their route was always going to be to go clerk for Lawrence Van Dyke and then work at Jones Day, crushing unions and immiserating little people's lives forever. Perhaps it's a salutary and good thing for students to start making those decisions and those judgment calls earlier on in their careers and earlier on in law school. Because if you're a 3L and you haven't really thought about the moral valence of your career trajectory and the trade-offs that you have made and the sacrifices that you have made to have the career you want in the law, you're really way behind. And it's something that you should have been thinking about from day one. And if you've been inundated with the nonsense that, enforcing Iqbal and Twombly against a victim of discrimination is just a totally normal, fine thing to do for a big law lawyer, crushing someone who has no money and no resources, you're maybe a lost cause by 3L. So this is a very long-winded answer to say we gotta show people the light early, and we have to lay out the stakes here and the balancing test here relatively early, and fight back against this perception of the law as being morally neutral, because it's not, it never will be. It's none of our faults that we're in this situation, but that's the legal system in the United States. And if someone feels like it's worth joining a club, a hotbed of insurrectionists in order to advance their career and get that coveted clerkship, they've sold their soul early, and they're probably not going to have an opportunity to buy it back.
Thanks, and thank you, Mark, for your time here today. And you've given us a ton to think about. We really appreciate it. It's great to have this discussion. I know you've got to run soon, so thanks everyone else who joined as well. There's a recording, so we'll share that as well. But take care and have a good rest of your week. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matt. Thank you to the organizers and thanks to everybody who attended. This was really great. And I'm so glad you're thinking about these issues. And I really appreciate you inviting me here today.
Take care all.